Hello, friends. Book summary of The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, expanding upon key events, reflections, and developments throughout Anne's diary. This version aims to provide a richer, more in-depth look into Anne's world. Part 1, June 1942 to December 1942. Chapter 1, June 12, 1942. Anne Frank begins her diary on her 13th birthday. She writes to an imaginary friend named Kitty, who serves as her confidant throughout the book. Anne reflects on her family and school life, sharing that she feels misunderstood by her mother and has a complicated relationship with her older sister, Margot. Anne feels lonely and isolated, describing herself as someone who doesn't fit in. She touches on the growing fears about the Nazis' rise to power and the increase in anti-Semitism in the Netherlands. She writes about her classmates, and although she has a few friends, she still feels like an outsider. She describes how, in response to these pressures, her family decides to go into hiding. Chapter 2. In this entry, Anne introduces the idea that the Frank family has gone into hiding. They move to the secret annex, a hidden part of Otto Frank's office building in Amsterdam. They are joined by the Van Don family, Mr. and Mrs. Van Don and their son Peter, and later a dentist named Albert Dussel. Anne describes the early days of hiding, where fear, silence, and routine dominate their lives. Anne expresses her difficulties adjusting to this new life: no privacy, no freedom to move about the city, and the constant threat of discovery. She reflects on the challenges of living with the Van Don family and becoming familiar with Peter, who initially seems shy and awkward to her. Chapter 3, Anne continues to adjust to her new life in hiding. She details the emotional challenges of being confined in a small space. The annex becomes more like a prison for Anne, where each day is spent in isolation, with little contact with the outside world. Tensions are high as the families in the annex attempt to coexist in such close quarters. Anne writes about the difficulties of living with the Van Don family, particularly Mrs. Van Daan, who Anne describes as self-centered and critical. Anne's relationship with Peter, the Van Don son, develops slowly as they begin talking more. At this point, she is still unsure about him, but finds solace in their shared experiences. Chapter 4. In this chapter, Anne begins to reflect more deeply on her family dynamics, especially her relationship with her mother. She writes that her mother is too critical, and Anne feels as though she has to hide her feelings to avoid upsetting her. She contrasts this with her father, Otto, who is gentle, understanding, and patient with her. Anne feels that her father is the only one who truly understands her. She also continues to adjust to life in hiding, detailing the complex emotions that come with it: the fear of being caught, the intense longing for freedom, and the deep isolation she feels. She writes about Peter, her growing bond with him, and how they have shared moments of deep conversation. Chapter 5. As time goes on, Anne writes more about her emotional struggles and the difficulties of maintaining privacy in the annex. She talks about the daily routines and the monotony of life in hiding, where every day feels the same. She reflects on the Van Don family's flaws, particularly Mrs. Van Don's vanity and selfishness. Anne's relationship with Peter deepens as they spend more time together. She discusses their relationship in detail, noting that while they do not have a romantic bond, they find comfort in each other's presence. Anne becomes more reflective in this chapter, thinking about her future and her desire to be a writer. She expresses a deep longing for a normal life and privacy, which seems impossible under the constant surveillance of hiding. Part 2, January 1943 to December 1943. Chapter 6. Anne writes about the psychological toll of life in hiding. The constant fear of discovery, along with the cramped and isolating conditions, affect everyone's mood. She shares her growing frustration with her mother and continues to seek comfort in her father. She talks about her emotional struggles, feeling a sense of shame and guilt for not being able to live up to her mother's expectations. Anne starts to recognize that she is changing, both physically and emotionally, and that her relationships with others are becoming more complex. She writes about how her friendship with Peter continues to evolve as they confide in each other about their frustrations and feelings. Chapter 7. Anne becomes more introspective as she writes about her desire for independence and freedom. She reflects on how difficult it is to be a teenager in hiding, constantly in close quarters with others, and with no real opportunities for personal growth or exploration. She describes her deepening bond with Peter, and they begin spending more time together, often talking about the war and their own fears and desires. She writes about how she envies Peter's ability to remain quiet and calm in difficult situations. The fear of discovery remains a constant presence, and Anne writes about how it has made her more aware of the preciousness of life. Chapter 8. Anne's writing becomes increasingly reflective and philosophical. She discusses her thoughts on religion, human nature, and the injustices of the war. Despite her concerns and fears, Anne continues to believe in the goodness of people and remains hopeful for the future. She writes about the moral questions raised by the war and her own thoughts on the human condition. The emotional strain of living and hiding begins to show as Anne becomes more aware of her own emotional growth. She writes about her desire to be more than just a girl in hiding, but someone who can contribute to the world after the war. Chapter 9. Anne expresses her desire to write more seriously, seeing her diary as a way to document her life and experiences. She talks about how much writing means to her and how it helps her process the overwhelming emotions of living in the annex. The daily pressures of hiding continue, and she writes about the constant stress of living with the Van Don family. The relationships within the annex are strained, especially as they are all forced to live so closely together. Anne becomes more and more critical of Mrs. Van Don's behavior and often complains about the petty conflicts that arise. She reflects on her changing feelings toward Peter and begins to feel a deeper connection with him. Part 3. January 1944, December 1944. Chapter 10. Anne's reflections in this chapter become even more mature. She writes about the emotional challenges of being a teenager in hiding and how it's difficult for her to maintain any sense of normalcy. She writes about her conflicting feelings toward her family, particularly her strained relationship with her mother and the complex emotions she feels toward Peter. Despite the growing tensions, Anne's bond with her father remains strong. She continues to develop a deeper understanding of herself, recognizing that the war is changing her and everyone around her. Her thoughts on the future become more pronounced as she imagines what life will be like after the war. Chapter 11. Anne writes more about her personal growth and how the annex has shaped her. She reflects on her interactions with Peter and begins to explore the feelings she has for him. They spend more time together, and their relationship deepens, though they still struggle to define what they mean to each other. Anne also continues to grapple with her identity as a young woman in such extraordinary circumstances. She writes about the constant fear of being discovered, the strain of living under the conditions in the annex, and the effect the war is having on everyone's mental health. Chapter 12. Anne writes about the constant fear of being caught and sent to a concentration camp and how that fear affects everyone's behavior. The annex is a place of constant stress, and Anne's observations of her family members reveal the emotional strain they are under. She writes about the growing tensions between the two families living there and how difficult it is to maintain any sense of normalcy. Despite these struggles, Anne continues to hold on to the belief that she will survive the war and that the world will recover. She discusses her desire to be a writer and how much she wants to contribute to the world once the war is over. Chapter 13. In this chapter, Anne's writing becomes more reflective. She writes about the importance of hope in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Anne's relationship with her family continues to be complicated, with her feelings toward her mother remaining strained. She continues to confide in her father, whom she deeply respects and admires. Anne also reflects on the importance of her education and her desire to continue learning, even in such a dire situation. The fear of being discovered remains ever present, but Anne remains determined to survive and to make a meaningful contribution to the world once the war is over. Chapter 14. Anne reflects on the passage of time and the psychological toll of living in hiding. She writes about her personal growth and how her experiences have shaped her perspective on life. She acknowledges the difficulties of being isolated and confined in the annex, but continues to find solace in her writing. She becomes more thoughtful and introspective, writing about her desire to live a full and meaningful life once the war is over. Chapter 15. Anne continues her reflections, writing about the moral and ethical challenges posed by the war. She writes about the ongoing strain of living in hiding, the lack of freedom, and the fear that constantly hovers over them. Anne's thoughts turn inward as she wrestles with her identity, her desires, and the person she is becoming. Despite everything, Anne writes about the strength of the human spirit and her belief that life will eventually return to normal. Chapter 16. Anne's thoughts grow even more philosophical. She reflects on her own spiritual beliefs, the nature of suffering, and the possibility of hope in the midst of darkness. She writes about the challenges of maintaining hope while being surrounded by fear and uncertainty. Anne continues to explore her relationship with Peter and her feelings of isolation. Despite her struggles, she holds on to the belief that there is goodness in the world and that humanity can emerge from this war stronger than before. Chapter 17. August 1st, 1944. Anne's final diary entry is filled with optimism. She writes about her dreams of becoming a writer and her belief in the goodness of humanity. Anne concludes her diary with the hope that the world will one day recover from the horrors of the war. Tragically, just days after this entry, the Frank family is betrayed and arrested. They are deported to concentration camps, and Anne dies in March 1945 at Bergen-Belsen. Conclusion: Anne Frank's diary ends abruptly, but it serves as a powerful testament to her resilience, wisdom, and hope in the face of unimaginable adversity. It has touched millions of readers around the world, standing as one of the most poignant documents of the Holocaust and the human experience during wartime. Anne's diary is a lasting legacy of her spirit, and her words continue to inspire and remind us of the importance of remembering history, recognizing the impact of prejudice, and fighting for human rights. Thanks for listening.